I looked at education and I just felt that it was ripe for disruption. It felt to me like the majority of higher education institutions were truly not serving their students. I've been inside the system. I was a dean for one of the largest nonprofit universities in the United States. A few years later, I actually went to work for Amazon Web Services. They wanted to partner with higher education institutions. And I look at AI the same way. I look at it as a tool that will morph, will migrate, will become more powerful. I think the graduate of the future will need to be very, very fluent in understanding how to leverage those tools. Let's do away with both tradition and exclusivity. Let's make it inclusive and innovative.
So this week, Guy Talks, Scott McKinley. Good to have you here.
Thanks so much, Graham. Great to be with you.
So you're a man of incredible talent, experience, and a background which uh, I think anyone would be proud to have, and very poignant as well, both in technology and in education. Would you like to give the viewers a background and your journey?
Yeah, thanks, Graham. I think it's been an interesting journey, certainly an interesting career. I first worked in financial services for the first couple of decades of my career. I lived and worked around the world and lived outside the United States for almost 18 years, mostly in the Asia Pacific region, but also in London. And rose to the level of a managing director. I ran the private equity group for JP Morgan, what is today JP Morgan Chase, out of the Asia Pacific region, and founded that part of our investment activities. And I just discovered over time that I was really driven a bit more by social impact than I was by funding the next widget factory in China or India. But I didn't really enjoy my international time a lot. But then nearly 25 years ago, I got involved in the higher education sector. I looked at education and I just felt that it was ripe for disruption. It felt to me like the majority of higher education institutions were truly not serving their students or the employers who hire those graduates in a way that made sense to me. It just felt like it was a bit of a broken model or a broken system. And I'm somewhat of a consider myself to be a fairly disruptive innovator. And so I looked at that as an opportunity and a challenge that would be enjoyable to tackle. And so I was part of a founding team that founded a university here in the United States. It's called Neumont College of Computer Science. And we built Neumont from the ground up. Essentially, we had the extreme luxury of starting with a whiteboard or a plain sheet of paper, which is very unusual in that sector, in the higher education sector. And very few people get the chance to start a university and to purpose build it from the ground up in a way that it would be um, built to really deliver high quality outcomes for every single student who attends the institution. So I did that. That went well. We built an institution that effectively placed 97% of all graduates coming out into the software engineering industry. And we did that in collaboration with some major partners, including IBM. And I enjoyed that experience very, very much. And then I went on to work for a large global holding company called Laureate Education, where we owned and operated 80 different universities around the world. So having had a lot of international experience before joining Laureate, and then having been at Neumont as a co-founder for nearly 6 years, it positioned me pretty well to understand how to help both acquire and integrate and then scale university systems around the world. And so we did that. I was involved in acquisitions and growth opportunities in Thailand, Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand. But I also got to see different models of higher education around the world. How did the British system work? How does the Scottish system work? What are the nuances of the system in India and China and the Philippines and all around the world, both the challenges and again the opportunities. So I enjoyed that. And then a few years later, I actually went to work for Amazon Web Services, the large cloud provider, and they were at the very early conceptual stage of standing up a cloud computing program that they wanted to partner with higher education institutions, of which there are 20,000 around the world. And so I started with myself in a cubicle and a small team in Seattle. And we scaled that from just a few thousand learners, again, university students that were at our partner universities, to what has now become several million learners have gone through the AWS Academy program. So I'm really proud of the work we did there, but it was really challenging but very interesting work to partner with universities and collaborate with them and encourage them to integrate curriculum that we provided along with hands-on lab experience for those students. So I've had a variety of experiences in the sector. I'd say my central theme has always been, can we try to at least make higher education a little bit more aligned with industry and aligned with the employment outcomes that most learners, and in some cases the younger learners, particularly, and their parents really need to launch their careers? Can we do that? Or are we going to take the position that really universities, that's not their job? Their focus is not to drive employment outcomes, it's to drive something different than that. And so that's been my professional background up to this point. I continue to serve as an advisory board member or board member on various ed tech and education, higher education initiatives around the world.
Yes, your background is extremely poignant. Having the experience in AWS, one of the major parties involved in what is the AI revolution. And from our perspective, with this particular season of GAEA Talks, we're very much focused on AI in business. And the business of education is something which is not commonly understood. I mean, with one of your ventures you're involved with, I've been contributing towards teaching with fourth rev with the London School of Economics. And I
Yes.
even learned a huge amount through, I think, 2 courses I've been involved with now. Seeing how people think, how they're looking at applicable skills to put to practice in industry. And it really made me think about, where's the value? What are people trying to achieve? And it was very different from what I imagined. But I think seeing how education could be and how it's traditionally been, there's a huge chasm. And if we look at what is going to be required in industry, and again, the type of companies we deal with and that we hear from, the guests that we have on the podcast, points out on a very, very regular basis, there is a huge need to think about education differently. What's your perspective on what the difference of traditional education is and where education needs to go, with that as a consideration?
Yeah, I appreciate that as a preamble a bit there, Graham. So look, I always hesitate to sort of beat up and be too too harsh on the existing education system in some senses. And that's because the people who work inside of the higher education institutions, their hearts are in the right place. They would not be serving for 10, 20, 30, 40 years of their lives and dedicating their lives to helping students and learners if they truly weren't motivated and if they weren't rewarded for the impact that their efforts have. Having said that, I think it's fair game. It's fair to pick at the system, like the ecosystem or the structures that are sitting there. I think that's very fair to apply some, to step outside of that system. I've been inside the system. I was a dean for one of the largest nonprofit universities in the United States. But I just would say, number one, I look at the system and say that largely the system is faculty led and faculty governed. So the primary lens through which a university will look at the world is through a faculty professorial academic lens, as opposed to a student lens, an employer lens, the administration's lens, any other key stakeholders, even public policy framework lens is not the primary lens. The lens is it's faculty led, it's faculty governed. And that creates a certain unique perspective. And it's been that way for literally centuries, right? So it's a guild of faculty members. So as a result of that, it's almost as if you have a system. Think of it almost, Graham, like a machine with two cogs. This cog over here is spinning at a medieval spin rate. It just sort of moves slowly. It runs on an agrarian calendar system, which shocked me when I came into the industry to realize that we had a massive sector of the economy was running on a multi-centuries old agrarian calendar system, right? We only teach in the winters when we can study by candlelight, and we work our farms and take care of our animals in the summer. summer months and harvest the crops. And literally, that's the academic model that exists all around the world. It's not just a Western European or a US structure. So we have this cog and it's spinning and it's moving fairly slowly because it was structured that way. It didn't need to be agile and adapt rapidly. It just ran. And we can study Greek mythology doesn't really go out of date, does it? Right? And studying Latin or studying any of the classics. And there are benefits to that. I would argue strongly there are certain benefits to that, to creating what I would call a T-shaped graduate. There are dimensions of studying the classics that can be very beneficial. And so, but this is the cog and it's spinning at this speed. What's happened, particularly over the last 50 years, is the industry employment cog wheel is spinning very, very rapidly. It's motoring along at sort of 5 to 10,000 RPM, where this cog over here is rolling at about 5 to 10 RPM. Well, those two cogs, there's no possible way for them to mesh. So you can criticize the cog that's spinning very, very slowly, but doesn't actually help much, right? Because it's not capable of spinning. The current governance structure and systems of higher education are not capable of spinning at 10,000 RPM. And frankly, most of the established universities, the elite, what I call the elite, whether you like the term or not, I call the elite institutions, they're effectively gilded. They have so much wealth and influence and power. There only are a handful of them, maybe 10 in America, maybe another 5 or 10 in the UK, a few in Australia, and so on around the world, a handful in China, that they're impervious. They're called continue to spin at that very, very slow RPM rate. It largely can ignore market forces, particularly in the US when you have a university that may have upwards of $50 billion in the endowment fund. So they can run the model that's been in existence for centuries and keep running it at exactly the same pace. And the challenge with that is that all the other institutions don't have 50 to $100 billion in their endowment fund. Like they're literally, you can count on one hand the ones that do. And so all the other institutions, but they all aspire to that same DNA, that same ethos of wanting to run things from a governance structure the way that they've been run elsewhere for literally centuries, almost a millennium in some cases, if you look at Oxford or Cambridge or other institutions that date back to 1096 or thereabouts. I mean, it's incredible, really. The history of higher education institutions is incredible. So those are a few observations. I mean, there are others that I could make. I think the traditional model is largely one size fits all. Whether you want to sit in the lecture hall or not, you're going to sit in the lecture hall. We're all going to take the same assessment. There's no true personalization going on. So a very lecture-centric model. It's more of a sage on the stage tradition as opposed to a mentorship or a coach type approach. There are some what I would call deviations or bright spots. I think the way medical doctors are prepared globally is very much a practical, hands-on, project based learning type of approach, because you cannot create a medical doctor that's competent in any other way. And there are a few other disciplines that I think do lean that direction, more of a professional approach. But if you think about the traditional universities, I would argue that the majority of students at elite universities are in the old model. A very small percentage, less than 20%, would be in the sort of new professional model that builds very robust T-shaped graduates, which is a term we can dive into a little bit. And that's the challenge. It's largely just a complete mismatch with the 21st century and what the world really needs at every level of industry and with the employers, what they need. It's a complete mismatch.
Well, it's interesting at this moment in time where the greatest economic impact since perhaps the introduction of the internet, in a similar way, has come out of academia. And I've noticed that the approach from its origins have been quite academic as such.
An interesting story that I heard from years ago that I think actually does put things a little bit in context, Graham. There was a governor's US 50 US states, 50 governors, but Bill Gates gave a speech to the US Governors Association a number of years ago. And this was on the K-12, on the, on the schools space. And he said, look, he said the US, the current version of the so-called modern school system was engineered and designed just after World War II. So think sort of vintage 1950. And in that era of the economy, 75 years ago, what was needed were about 15%, maybe 20% of the students going through would want to be prepared for college, post high school, university level positions, i.e., what we'd call white collar. And the other 80+% would largely be blue collar trades people. That was the economy in America in 1950. Of course, what's happened in the intervening, and he described the schools as a purpose-built factory that was engineered and was designed to do that. And it did a great job at it. It did a wonderful job. So for all those decades, the problem is it just keeps motoring on. And he said to point fingers at the factory managers and the factory employees, it wasn't being pejorative about the term. He was just pointing out that this institution had been designed and built to serve a certain market. And actually, the market had changed so dramatically, but the factory had never changed. And it'd be quite difficult to change it. It's not easy. And so Gates's approach, the Gates Foundation approach, was to begin to fund some innovative startups that would launch a new approach, new school, effectively start a new series of new schools that would take a different approach where they're designed for 90+% of the students to go on to college and get professional education and be able to enter the modern world in a successful way, to be launched successfully, because we no longer need 80-90% trades people. We do need some, of course we need them, but it's not, the ratio is completely upside down.
Well, I think that comes down to critical thinking and observing what is. Because if you look at what I was saying before, like many industries, which are revolutionizing how we live, how we work, how the economies are fueled, so to speak, it comes out of academia. So there is a natural instinct, and we can see this where OpenAI, effectively the Transformer white paper, which Google owned and didn't do anything with for a while, this massive race came out of academic ideas, and they went to the public domain. Suddenly, they've affected the world in a very different way, and we're seeing already papers not being published. They're instead trade secrets. And if you think of companies like Lockheed Martin, they don't publish their latest, greatest ideas because
Right.
otherwise you would take away all the value. So you have a conflicting view, even from an investment standpoint, of why fund something when you're going to give all the trade secrets away. Even the Coca-Cola recipe is a trade secret. And you build businesses with retaining the ability to create something, and the product is sent out to the world. So the benefit is realized by providing value. And then you look at, well, how do you prepare for a changing economy, and how do you look ahead? I mean, we had in this country, suddenly everyone was encouraged to go to university, but that just watered down what the priorities and the value was. Well, we had no tradespeople here. Now the tradespeople are the ones earning a huge amount of money because there's very few tradespeople. Um, we're looking at a world where the question we always see with business, and when we had James McQuivey from Forrester on, he was saying the number one question he gets asked all the time is, how can we reduce headcount from a savings perspective? But if you look 3 years ahead, 5 years ahead, it should be, how do you create value? And from an educational standpoint, what can I choose to do that will be valued in 3 to 5 years and beyond?
Yeah, I agree with that, Graham, 100%. Yeah, educating people for a world that no longer exists isn't very useful, right? Essentially. And so then the question does become, how do you future-proof, to use a buzzword, I guess, but how do you future-proof an education? Now, some would argue, yes, some would argue you future-proof it by simply acquiring the skills and capabilities that are tried and true. And I don't disagree with that. The problem is in education, we're always using ors instead of ands, conjunctions. We like the two-letter conjunction, not the three-letter conjunction. So let me explain what I mean by that. Or would be, I can either train to the top of this T-shaped graduate. So I can train for critical thinking, strong strategic thinking skills. I can train for communication skills. I can train for problem solving skills. Those will largely be sustainable skills and will future proof a graduate. But I'm not going to train for the stem of the T, which would be deep technology or deeper engineering type skills that might be only valid for 18 to 24 months in the modern world, but then will be replaced by something else that are rapidly changing. And my view is you don't have to do or, you can do and then there's actually a third and. So it's vocational and academic slash top of the T, these so-called soft skills or leadership skills or the top of the T. But you also and can train or educate to how to learn and keep replacing the stem of the T. Right. So how do I become, to use the buzzword again of the day, a lifelong learner? How do I do that? Can I equip a student to have soft skills, strong soft skills around some of those skills and capabilities we just discussed, as well as the stem of the T? If I don't have the stem of the T, an employer will not hire 98% of graduates today. If I have the Oxbridge degree, the Ivy League degree, fine. I'm going to get a job. My parents have social capital. I've interned on Wall Street for 3 consecutive summers. I'm going to get a job with a hedge fund or a private equity fund or a leading consulting firm. That is a given. And then I will learn the stem of the T because I'm a smart lad or lass, and I'll pick it all up, right? That's fine. That's not what we're trying to solve for. That is 0.1% of the entire student body in the world are privileged enough to get into those institutions. So for the masses, can we stop using or in higher education and start thinking about and? Vocational is a very dirty word for most higher education institutions. I don't know if it is in the UK, but here in the UK, in the US, as soon as you say the word vocational, all of the leading academics get up in arms and they don't like that. And they hate the word training as well. Training is not education in their mind. Training is just very short term. I'm learning how to use this tool. They're very adverse to learning a tool from Google or a tool from Microsoft or a tool from Amazon Web Services because in their mind, it's just beneath them. It's
Well,
beneath them.
there's practice, putting things into practice. I mean, we've had Floyd, former SAS, in here, and one of the functions of the SS is to become a training unit, in effect, to become well skilled in lots of different skills. But the key, like any successful person, is to enrich the experiences by putting them into practice. And
Agreed.
the problem that I think is a global problem now, which traverses business and education, is the putting into practice. But now we find ourselves in a situation where the equivalent of 3 to 5 years is now 3 to 5 months. And the
Yes,
typical attitude is, well, if it's going to change, I won't bother. I'll wait until there's something sustainable long term. But in a time of huge change, actually, the change is a byproduct of the experience of what you're doing, because then change makes sense. You're rapidly iterating in order to understand what works, what doesn't work. So it's the combination of critical thinking. We're seeing it in business. So the initial application of AI, a statement which I've heard many times: businesses must adopt AI. Also, there's no such thing as a finished product because the industry is so new. All true. And if you don't do it, you'll end up like the companies that didn't adopt the internet. Also true. Now, the key question is, well, how should we think? What questions should we ask, and how should we seek answers correctly? Now, the initial adoption of AI, given I would say, and here's some thoughts, and you can tell me what your interpretations are on this. I would consider the majority of AI consumer AI. And if you look at the laws, the rules, the regulations, the type of psychology, the experience of why someone does something personally, it's very different from a mission-driven objective of the company. For example, you may like some sport, you may like to travel, you may like many things, you may like films, music, different types of music. But when you're in work, you're part of a unit trying to achieve an objective. Your role within that is complementary with others. Maybe you work with a level of autonomy, but you are measured upon a metric of success and failure, which is relatively discernible given your job function, your department, and the function of the company. Maybe you make pizzas to sell to supermarkets. Maybe you're a financial institution. It is, by its very existence, definable where you know what good and bad
Right.
looks like. If you're
Yeah.
a private individual, you're in a mood for something, you enjoy something, you share time with friends, it's very, very different. You don't have to have the structure. I mean, yeah, maybe you want to make your bed in the morning. Maybe that's something that it is important to you, so your day starts well, but it's subjective. In the professional environment or within the constraints of business, you should be able to make decisions, say, well, let's ask the right questions. Now, many questions I think are beginning to become apparent because we haven't seen the adoption of consumer AI in business, because business has GDPR, it has security concerns, it is probably taking care of lots of customer data, it has perhaps regulation. These are all things which are not applicable to consumer AI. So consumer AI hasn't built in all of these things. And then as soon as you try to put that into businesses, well, there are a lot of flaws. There are a lot of concerns. It's actually potentially very dangerous unless you ask the right questions. That then forms an educated view of, well, what should you do? Well, we have laws to protect people. So we need legal expertise, we need infrastructure expertise, and obviously being at AWS, you'll understand the importance of that very well. But then we're talking about engineering. Yes, we have a capability born out of AI, but what is a rational, safe, fair, functional, engineered use to solve a problem within a particular company for a role or a sector? So education is extremely important. And one thing we do know in the future, people do need to be educated in the wider context of what are we trying to achieve. And that does
Yes.
require known skill sets. And like the SAS, if you can have a decent comprehension of core skill sets, you are increasing the probability of the success of the organization you work for and your success in your career, which should then, in my personal opinion, inform what is important with regards to education. And again, I hear from a number of people we're both are good friends with, the idea that what was the function of university in many ways. As a young person, to go into university, one person I know who runs a bank said what they were looking for is to make sure someone can stick it through for a period of time,
Yeah.
they can turn up, they can pay attention, and they can run the course. That's 99% of entering the job market. Because if you can demonstrate those skills, then that's a good foundation to then figure out, well, what are you good at? How can you apply yourself? Where would you fit? What is your optimal position and your optimal role to really bring out your greatest talent? Because the better that you perform, the more that you contribute, the better you get personal reward and the better result you give towards your component part of a business. That's the ingredients of success. There's also the particular skills, but it does seem a lot of the point and purpose has been forgotten, and people are not asking the right questions or looking at the information around them. They've learned
Yeah,
how to tick boxes.
on that last point, Graham, I think I would argue, or at least propose for consideration, until about all the way through the 1980s, until about 30 to 40 years ago, what you described as what employers were largely looking for and willing to hire was accurate. And what they were checking on persistence and grit and some brain power, but largely persistence, grit, stick-to-itiveness, and a passion to learn, a passion to grow, a willingness to contribute. And they didn't care so much about whether you had super in-depth technical skills or this or that, the other thing, because a lot of that was simply acquired on the job. And again, the sprocket in the machine was spinning. Yes, education was spinning at that speed, but it was able to deliver those qualities and characteristics and cases just described. Whereas industry was spinning at about this speed. So the two weren't misaligned massively. And I think what's changed now, you can have all the qualities that you just described: grit, persistence, curiosity, a willingness to stick at the task, eventually discover what you're good at. I would argue strongly that 95, 98% of those jobs are not available today at entry level. If you go on LinkedIn today and you look at the percentage of jobs that effectively are entry level jobs, it's about 0.02%. Very, very low. That would not have been the percentage even 20 years ago. And so the employers are part of this ecosystem. And of course, then as a result, both sides are now going to be pointing fingers at the other side, right? The ivory tower will point fingers across the chasm at the industry and say, well, it's your fault. You're not pulling any students across the bridge, across the moat. And the employers will say, well, it's your fault in the ivory tower because you're not preparing them for industry. So neither side, both sides just talk past each other on these issues. I think to AI, it's really fascinating the issue you just raised, which is clearly AI for business applications will differ from AI for consumer. Well, then what about education? Is education a consumer facing or is it industry? Are we solving business problems? And I think the answer actually is yes. It's yes. So would I think about that? I would say if you look at the applications of AI, and we're early days here, Graham, right? We're very early days. But if I look at the current structures of universities and where AI could be successfully, or at least attempted to be successfully embedded, I would say one, very clearly there's an opportunity to embed it on a B2B basis within the operations and the administrative functions of a university. Enrollment, admissions processes, student services processes. In the US, our financial aid application process is very complex for most individuals to get through successfully, requires a lot of manual intervention and handholding of both the parents and the students. Those are all areas where AI can be extremely valuable today, right now. A couple of SMEs, a couple of subject matter experts, a decent programmer, and we would be able to turn around a financial aid application using AI and ML within a week. Like it's just available. It's ripe for the opportunity, and I'm sure that I'm not the only one that would be pointing that out. But then, if you say, could we automate and massively improve the efficiency of curriculum development? Yes, absolutely. No problem. So I view that as more of what I would call in your earlier description, sort of a B2B application. And there are others in the university, all the way through from the start of a student's journey of the admissions enrollment to the teaching and learning environment, to an LMS environment, learning management system environment, student information systems, CRM platforms, financial aid, registrar functions, financial functions. Like any enterprise, those can all be improved, in my opinion, fairly dramatically embedding AI. The bigger challenge becomes, what about the consumer, so-called consumer? What about the learner? How would we personalize learning? And what apps are available? Apps, AI, what innovation is available to actually improve the student experience, to make the learning um, more relevant, more personalized, a better learning experience. And last thought before I turn it back to you is you mentioned something earlier, which is really important. Ultimately, most of the skills we want to develop for the 21st century need to be done in a practice-based environment. So how do we scale that and maintain quality? Right? And is it historically the professors in academia that realized that this was so important, they would tend to chuck a sort of a senior project in lieu of writing a beautiful thesis paper. Let's not do that. Let's actually have a hands-on team approach to solving an industry project or solving some fairly complex area of practice. And of course, when the students would graduate and interview with their prospective employers, guess what they spent most of the time, 90% of the time they would talk about? Not the courses that they had gotten through successfully and what their grades were, they talked about their project, right? So we know that practice, project and team-based learning is critically important. Can AI play a role in helping to enable that to happen at scale within the university system or within higher education or within some next generation learning environment that we want to that ideally would be created in the next number of years?
I think it can. I mean, I hear a lot of things, I'm researching, I'm talking to a huge amount of people. So I naturally begin to see all the different angles and perspectives. And something that I believe and the people around us believe, there is a quantum shift on a capability level, which is going to change the dynamics. And going back to what we were just both discussing there, looking at AI for consumers and AI for business, I completely agree with what you're talking about, the business of university. But I think even with businesses, there is a consumer-esque AI, given that a business is predominantly made up of humans. I think Steve Jobs once said, a business is simply a collection of individuals with a common goal. So if we looked at it from that perspective, and every employee is a unique human being. Now, there's context, and that's always the thing that seems to be missing. So if we introduced context and said, like an employee that's a learner, they are naturally individual human beings. They are different. We are all different in many different ways. But the context is you're here to achieve an objective, to learn, to become, to gain value, which will be to the benefit of your life, moving into the jobs market, learning things as a human being. It's not all just about the work, because effectively, if you look at it from the personalized approach, well, how do you increase communication, comprehension, understanding? Now, AI, I know there are elements which the capabilities can be brought together. This will play a huge change, or a huge shift in the development, but it's a shift of thinking fundamentally. And if we can look at a multimodal capability, which the AI, perhaps even introducing zero knowledge. The concept of zero knowledge is the individual owns the data. I've seen a handful of use cases where people have needed to aggregate data over a long period of time, which can be authenticated as genuine, but lots and lots and lots of little bits of data, but they don't want to share that data until they need to share that with a specific trusted authority for a specific purpose, at which point it's all their data and they're sharing the net result of it. So if we look at the idea of advanced small models in combination, so it's, you said it before, and or cloud-based, private cloud-based, and local-based, rather than only edge or only cloud.
Yes.
Merge together and say, what works? What are we trying to achieve? How can we treat everyone as an individual, help AI or enable AI to give them the absolute best experience, to create optimal results, to truly be highly personal, yet within a structure which has context. You're learning, uh, you're at university to learn X topic because your objective is to understand, to learn, to enrich your network, to one day graduate and enter this particular marketplace. So how can that carry on with you? And how can you, again, get access in a way which is currently not scalable? Because this is the human limiting factor is, if there's one professor, yeah, you could do a video and maybe send it to 1 million people, but it's really one form of engagement. But if you could get the subject matter expertise and the context, and not say it's either or, it's all of these concepts together and deliver something of real experiential value on scale horizontally rather than cumulatively, then I think in 5 years' time, it's not going to be people looking at their favorite YouTuber. They're going to be engaging with their favorite person. Education would be a fantastic sort of viewpoint of that. And I mean, movie-esque. Your Obi-Wan Kenobi, your grand teacher, the professor that taught you what really changed your life, the person that inspires you. But Obi-Wan Kenobi lives with you for many, many, many years. And that, maybe we all get our own Obi-Wan Kenobi, but each one knows us by name, knows our nuances, knows our
Yeah.
story, but we own the data, completely private. Well, if you take the approach that everything has to be purely open cloud based, so the LLM models, when I talk about this a lot, then by the very definition, you can't have all these other opportunities. But this is where innovation is great, because innovation is not bound by rules of, well, this is how we've always done it. And I think we've almost, even within 2 years, got into a rut. This is how AI is done. People will say, well, you train a model and then you do this and then you do that. No, that's a way, but there are many other ways. There's the evolutions of thinking. There are different ways of thinking. There's a lot of different options at the table. And I
Yeah,
think there's
I agree
huge
with that
potential.
thinking. I completely agree with that thinking, Graham. So I like the Obi-Wan analogy. So I want Obi-Wan to be personalized to me. I want to control my data so that it's not floating around ubiquitously in cyberspace and can be stolen and frauds perpetrated and all those ugly dark web things. And I want Obi-Wan to grow with me as I'm learning and growing. My project sets and my experiences may be more nuanced, more challenging, just mature. Let Obi-Wan enable me to walk that path of Jedi, that Jedi path, in a way that increasingly I grow, I learn, and Obi-Wan just keeps mentoring me, challenging me, instructing me sometimes in a voice that I'm very comfortable with and that I appreciate. I guess if the day came that I wanted to change Obi-Wan out for some other guru, mentor, that would be fine, I suppose. But I like that model. I also agree strongly that inevitably in tech, innovation comes up, but then frankly, within a couple of years, what was really innovative 2 years earlier has now become pretty much just standard state of play. And I think we're seeing that already with AI, right? The public LLM models will have limitations, as you've pointed out. And so what's next? Well, data distribution looked this way a decade ago or longer ago, and then suddenly we had edge, right? We had CDNs and edge delivery capabilities and more power compute sitting out at the edge, and so on and so forth. So I mean, there are other analogies we could use, or other models, other examples we could cite on how things may in fact change and morph within the AI world. But I think hyper personalization and localization will rule the day. The AI that is able to be um, friendly to us, psychologically relevant to us and our individual needs, I think will be very powerful. I still look at where we are now. I mean, yes, people are very excited about it. I think the current hype is now on its way down, right? Right. We go through these hype cycles, and I've seen, I'm not the youngest guy probably on the call here. I mean, I've seen many of these tech cycles. We're now on the way down off of the outrageous overhype that's going on. But I just I still think there's so much room for innovation. I mean, even just basic consumer functionality is still really not we're not even close to that yet. A smart EA, a smart executive assistant that can handle all my travel, all my booking, all my banking, all my requests. And it's not that doesn't exist yet, you know. Is somebody working on it? I don't know, but I just know that my cell phone should have much, much, much more personalized functionality than it has today with using voice to just drive a whole series of things that it cannot do today.
Well, we noticed when we had Karen Howe on, so she wrote the book Empire of AI, and it's something not commonly discussed, which is pre OpenAI and Sam Altman's push for scale. The general consensus in the academic world was in the direction of smaller, more efficient, more personal. So if we really observe and we're very rational about it, if 90% of the narrative out there in the public domain, which has led to the common belief of what AI is, does, and can do, were the limitations created by the choice of massive scale and complete generalization, obviously led to the hype. But unlike previous hype cycles, I think it's opened uh, the the idea and the acceptance of artificial intelligence. But I think it's potentially misrepresented the true potential. And I think we'll see innovation proving that potential realization in much more practical and functional ways that genuinely move the needle, both in business, both as individuals, both in entertainment, in many, many ways. And
Yeah.
people will think, whether this works, this is really good. Because it's able now, given the funding generally in artificial intelligence and the acceptance of AI as a concept which is going to change the world, but not in the ways that were told initially. Usually the first is not the best. The first paves the way so that people are open to the conversation to look. And I think observation is going to be absolutely critical. I mean, I always think if you look at 3 years' time and 5 years' time, and you look at now, how many people are studying at PhD level artificial intelligence worldwide? And how many will there be in 5 years? The shift will be absolutely huge. And we saw it at, when everyone started to go to university due to political narratives changing and the encouragement to go to university. Suddenly, there are millions of people doing media studies. Now, what happens when you saturate a market? But also, when there's probabilistically, maybe there's more successful commercial artists, more successful photographers. On a scale basis, what does it really look like when in even 3 years' time, the amount of skills that are available for innovation is probably 10,000 times what it is today? And what
Yeah.
impact will that have when we suddenly see more and more innovation? What will that mean to the jobs market? What are people going to be looking for? What skill sets? What innovations will have the impact and the effect? What will be the expectations? I don't Now you pick up an iPhone, you take it for granted. It's got, I don't know, however many K camera, and it can connect to the internet. You can speak to your friends across the world for free in incredible high quality via servers like WhatsApp on FaceTime. Think about when I think this is something James McCovey said, so it's not even something I can take credit for. And I think he's very right in saying it. The first time the iPhone came out is nothing like the 15th time an iPhone came out.
Right.
Today, we're like on the first iPhone, and now we're going to see opportunities for other things. Education is perhaps observing, what do we think the fourth or fifth generation looks like, and what's the scale. We look back in history, we can see what's going to happen. Take the phrase AI out of it, and we've probably got a good idea
Yeah,
how this is going to play out.
I agree. And I do think orders of magnitude that you're describing there is probably accurate. It'll be 10,000x and then 100,000x will be more
Yeah.
involved. So I look at AI, if I think about what's happened with computer science and software engineering and architecture over the last 20 plus years, I mean, having been a founder of a university that focuses on software engineering and architecture and modeling, software modeling, um, it was once the exclusive domain of a very rarefied group of leading experts in the world. Literally, not quite, but pretty much you could count the leading players on one or two hands around the world that played in software modeling and architecture at that level. And now it became much more prevalent. And I look at AI the same way. I look at it as a tool that will morph, will migrate, will become more powerful, whether it's that generalized, centralized, massive LLM model or the more discrete, localized, private data sets. I think the graduate of the future will need to be very fluent in understanding how to leverage those tools. But those tools only become valuable if you use them to build things that are deployable and add value. Like the tool in and of itself has no value. Like it's like a car that you don't know how to drive, right? So these are going to be Ferraris and Lamborghinis and Maseratis, very impressive cars, but someone actually has to know how to drive them. Not only that, they have to know how to integrate them. And that takes a bit of what I would call design thinking, that you're working, we use the phrase at Amazon often called working backward. You're working backward from the job to be done. What are we designing for? What solution are we trying to build? So I view the graduates that are needed now today and that will go 10,000x and 100,000x and a million X of these graduates will be graduates who understand design thinking principles, understand project and program management, the ability to move from theory to practice very quickly, to rapidly prototype, to be fluent with the tools. So maybe 50 or 100 years ago, the tool du jour was Latin. It's no longer Latin, it's AI. Maybe it was valuable to learn how to speak Spanish or Russian or Chinese. Language skills are still valuable in today's world. But I think with the advent of AI, the AI tool will become even more valuable. And it will just think of it as a language. It's a tool, it's a language. Become very valuable. Now, does that mean that if I only know AI that I'm valuable? No, because it's the design thinking, it's the project management, it's the implementation, it's how to work in an agile. I think agile methodology is a useful methodology for all graduates to learn how to implement. How do we scrum? How do we huddle and disperse? How do we take responsibility for delivering on time, on budget? A bit of financial literacy wouldn't hurt. A bit of strategic thinking, product market fit. So these aren't disciplines that aren't readily available today. They generally are readily available, but now we need to integrate somehow into them this language, the lingua franca or the tool sets of AI now need to be embedded inside of these other capabilities and personal abilities that'll sit around AI. And by the way, to our earlier conversation, guess what will happen with the AI tool sets? Every 6 months, they'll all migrate, change, and improve, or some will be thrown away and replaced by other tools.
I think in many ways, the word that springs to mind is consequence. So consequence-driven education, and I say that based on what you've just said there. We look at the rapid prototyping but a prototype to production is a different universe. What's the consequence if you deploy a prototype thinking it's production ready? The risks are enormous from a security perspective.
Yeah.
From a scalability, it falls down after 20 people use it. So, well, what's the consequence of not well, of spending a huge amount of time something that you think is great, but you never checked would work in the real world and people aren't willing to pay for? What's the consequence of not considering security? What's the consequence of not looking at the flow of data or having data integrations considered properly? What's the consequence of failing to market a product? Or what?
Yes.
I mean, you could, as well as I do, the
I like that.
list
I
is
like
as
that
long as you
phraseology.
can imagine. And it's all of these questions which you're not aware are there to be asked. And the most magical thing in the world is real world experience. Even if in education you have an interest in a particular thing. Yes, you used to be C# as a program language, now the vibe coding, but what's the consequence? If you're working and learning as a collaborative team where, let's say, you take charge of marketing, but I understand and have visibility of what you're doing, I'm doing the system architecture because it's all, how do I look at the considerations of everyone around me and begin to see, and vice versa for everyone, then you can see the consequences that often within a team, if you're not aware, well, it doesn't affect me, so what's the problem? Well, then you all fail because it fell down here. If nobody markets a product and you've invested a load of money, you've architected it brilliantly, you've done everything, it's designed, the UI is fantastic, it performs incredibly well, but no one knows it exists. At any particular point, you're looking at the failure points, and I just think there's no real replacement for really understanding. Now, AI could mimic that experience from a multimodal
Hmm.
perspective and say,
Hmm.
right, be part of a team. I mean, even in football, if your job is to score and you're a striker, you're up front, well,
Yeah.
unless somebody's passing you the ball, unless it's played through, unless you can understand and perhaps even know what it's like to play in those different positions, who's looking out for what? How can everyone work together? You can have your special focus area, but you need to have an appreciation of every other team member. AI
Yeah.
could replicate that experience and really enrich the learning process fantastically, which has real world context.
Yeah. So Graham, that I agree with very, very strongly. At Newmont, one of the founding principles there for education was not just project-based learning, but team-based learning. There's a difference. A lot of people just throw out the term project-based learning and they assume that, well, if I as an individual have experiential learning, and maybe it's an internship, an externship, a co-op, in the UK, I know degree apprenticeships are quite popular where you're working. That's all fine. That's great. But again, we need to apply an and. It's project and team-based. Why team-based? Because to address the issues that you were just walking through around consequences, it's very useful to have a team. Think of it as sort of mini crowdsourcing, where someone in the team raises their hands and say, "Excuse me, I've seen this movie before. This ends in disaster. If we don't build this to scale, if we don't build this for security purposes, if we don't build this, the unintended consequences could be disastrous." At Amazon, we also used a phrase called looking around corners. And it takes a certain mindset to look around corners to be aware. And some of it is experiential based. Sometimes you simply don't know what monsters and dragons lurk around the corner if you've never seen the monsters and
But
dragons
that's the
before.
personalized component. That's why personalization is so important because we
Yeah.
all, as different people, different backgrounds, from different cultures, we're all completely unique. But there's a probability that because we are unique, we may see things people around us don't. and they may see things around them that could help them. So
Yes.
the personalized component of that, of the future of AI, um, complementing individuals within contexts and structures, has far more value than people can imagine. And there is a real risk that if the illusion of the narrative of AI as it is currently put out is you don't need anyone, you can do it all yourself and it'll do it for you. What is it?
Yeah,
What's the
that's a
consequence?
false. I think that's a false narrative.
I
Well,
I, I agree.
it will lead to points of failure. It just will
Yeah.
lead to points of failure because the the illusion will be there that that AI can help inform me of all of the corners that I can't look around, but it will come up with a list. It will come up with its list. Maybe it's hallucinating, maybe it's not. It'll come up with its list of 4 or 5 things that I hadn't considered, consequences I hadn't considered. And I'll say, oh, that's awesome. Those are 3 or 4 things I would never have thought of on my own that AI has now helped me think about. I now need to go and address those. I address those, not realizing that the AI did not provide the diversity of thought, the diversity of experience that I actually need. And I would gain if I were working in a project team of 4 or 5 other colleagues from very, very different backgrounds than mine. So that's a really interesting question, observation, I believe, about AI. Can it actually replicate the diversity of opinion, input, and experiences that would come from even a 5 person or a 10 person or a 50 person team?
Well, it's
Uh,
an interesting observation that I've seen in the media from users moving from chat GPT 4 to 5. One of the greatest criticisms, as in a large average majority of feedback, is not whether it tells more accurate answers, but it's not as nice. It doesn't seem to compliment people as much.
okay.
So it's
Right.
the first time I've seen really
I
wide
don't like the
scale.
personality. It got rid of its nice personality, did it?
Yeah, because it didn't agree with people as much. But
Right.
think about that. If that system is being sold as the greater good of humanity, and it's not really about you've got access to potentially a massive amount of knowledge, but it's just becoming a yes man.
Right.
And then
Right.
as soon as you say, actually, we've fixed it, so it's more accurate now. No, I don't like that. I prefer the previous version. Then the actual motives of where people see the value in common consumer AI is fundamentally misguided from the narrative we were sold it would create the greater good of humanity.
Yeah. That's very interesting. I had not heard that data point yet. It's just not as nice. I find that really interesting. I don't really care to be informed. Just please be nice to me, whatever you do, right?
But again, if you're going to learn something, I mean,
Yeah.
I dealing with people like Floyd, who is actually extremely nice. But in order to get results and to, I've had the experience with obviously music industry as well, with the artists I've worked with. Being nice is not how you get results. The reason they're looking to become elite at what they're doing in performance and in every aspect is because they aspire to be the absolute best version of themselves, which means they want to be challenged, which is often being told, no, you are not right. That is not good enough. So, but here's some context of how you can become better. But if you're just nice all the time, then it's not really as helpful. Doesn't mean you'd have to be rude or horrible, but
Well, whoever controls the nice functionality of ChatGPT 5 will have to figure out how to make it nicer.
yeah, I think that some of these models had to be turned back on. But
Yeah.
so before we close out, are there any final thoughts which you'd like to get across?
I guess two thoughts. I think on AI for higher education specifically, I think there are two likely pathways here. One, I do believe, even though the sprocket and the cog runs very slowly, I do believe higher education will need to begin implementing at a serious level AI. I think the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, will be within the administration and operational aspects of the university. That's just a business function that they can be improved. I would hope, given that universities these days are incredibly financially stressed broadly around the world, that they will realize that there are some efficiency gains to be made there, that the student experience can be improved, the administration and faculty experience can be improved, all while lowering costs. And I think that that's very, very doable and viable. I also think AI can be increasingly embedded into the learning and teaching environments of universities. That'll be a little more challenging. There'll be some resistance to that, et cetera. Separately, I do believe, Graham, that there will be one or more groups around the world to begin to stand up institutions that look and feel very differently than this sort of medieval models of higher ed that we've been both blessed and increasingly cursed with. So, and I would applaud innovators to think about ways that they can introduce education. It needs to be inclusive. It needs to be very affordable. Obi-Wan Kenobi needs to be present, some form of that avatar type lifelong coach and mentor that is highly personalized, albeit protecting along the lines of GDPR and US FERPA and so on, protecting our data, protecting especially for children, for younger learners, but even for adults. And I think that's very doable. I think the tools are available to do it right now today. So I think we'll see entrepreneurial organizations coming along that will begin to address market. Why does it cost multi hundreds of thousands of dollars for this degree at the elite institutions? It shouldn't. So that creates one of my earlier mentors in higher education said there are two principles about higher education you need to understand, Scott. It runs on two principles. One is tradition, and the second one is exclusivity. And as an entrepreneur within the sector, I would argue strongly that let's do away with both tradition and exclusivity. Let's make it inclusive and innovative in order to meet the real need that exists. Understanding that we're not going to throw away that top of the T. All those skill sets that you and I have talked about, Graham, on this conversation, they do need to be present with graduates in the 21st century. But I also think that we can begin to create graduates that have not only those soft skills, leadership skills, critical thinking skills, all of those skills, but also are very adept and highly adaptive in a world that is changing extremely rapidly on the technology side, and frankly in business, not just technology, but in business as well. So I'm looking forward actually to the next 5 to 10 years, because I think within the next even 3 to 5 years, I think we're going to see innovations within the sector. It will challenge the establishment, of course. It will challenge the regulatory framework, probably. It may have to be done outside of the standard regulatory and accreditation frameworks that exist. But like most innovations, they tend to be a bit disruptive and a bit challenging in the early days, and then eventually they go mainstream as hundreds of thousands and then millions of learners begin to be able to obtain education at, frankly, very likely at a fraction of the cost of the way it's done today. So I think we're going to see that in a relatively short period of time, and I hope we do. I hope we do.
Excellent. Well, I have no doubt this is a time of incredible opportunity, and like everything in the world, the things that work and that people see the opportunity and they see the value will be adopted, and the younger generations will help redefine
Yes.
how we think about education and how we think about business. So on that note, Scott, it has been an absolute pleasure. Really appreciate your time, and
Thanks, Graham, so much. Enjoyed spending time with you today. Take care.
wonderful. Take care.